Hello and welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where bad comics burn. It's Christmas time! But wait, aren't we still in the middle of celebrating Doctor Who's 60th anniversary, even though I was late to the party on that? Yeah, but I planned for this. Yes, in anticipation of the schedule slipping, I took the opportunity to make sure that even if I had to cut or rearrange things, the final Doctor Who reviews would also be holiday-themed. Two great tastes that go better together. After all, Doctor Who and Christmas have a long history with each other, even within this show. I've frequently spoken that I think my best string of holiday episodes included the time the Doctor fought a demon with his magic box while working with Santa Claus, and I could do my standard shrug and say comic books, but the truth is Doctor Who is like that in the main TV show sometimes too. But Doctor Who on TV has had frequent Christmas celebrations, especially in New Who, where the Christmas special is always anticipated. Sometimes it's the last adventure for the Doctor, sometimes the first, sometimes it's an imaginative retelling of a beloved classic, sometimes it's a depressing episode where everyone good dies and the Doctor literally ascends with angels holding on to him, and yeah, Voyage of the Damned sucks. Hell, it was actually a surprise for people when for the 13th Doctor, they decided to eschew the holiday tradition and instead go for New Year's celebrations. I liked them myself, though maybe all three being Dalek stories was pushing it. In any case, we've looked at a classic Doctor Who episode, we read through the very first outing, but now let's talk about one of the more interesting and bizarre parts of Doctor Who history. The Wilderness Years! I take for granted that people understand what I mean by classic Who and New Who. Doctor Who was effectively cancelled in 1989. There were attempts at revivals, talk of a big-budget movie, a reboot where the Master was the Doctor's brother and they were looking for their father and Cybermen had Wolverine claws or something. It was weird. There was even a project that eventually turned into the bizarre charity special Dimensions in Time. Tales from the Old Web! Back in the 90s, with no access to video clips or even behind-the-scenes info, the only thing we had were .wav files for audio clips, and discovering that there was this special that featured a bunch of previous Doctors and companions together, I wanted it so bad, and there was this kid in our day camp who claimed to have a copy, and she never brought it in to let me see it. If she truly had it, she was probably doing me a favor. Don't watch Dimensions in Time, kids. But the point is that Doctor Who may have been off of television, but it was continuing on in other mediums, books and comics in particular. They were very creative, sometimes very inappropriate for children, but it was never boring, even if it was bad, depending on your point of view. However, the biggest attempt at a revival was in 1996 with the release of the TV movie that regenerated Sylvester McCoy into Paul McGann's 8th Doctor. I am a fervent defender of the 1996 movie. Part of the problem is that you need to approach it not as some bitter elder fan, but rather like I did, as a 9-year-old who was starved for new Doctor Who content and seeing what was effectively the best that Doctor Who had ever looked in ever. It's certainly not perfect, but for what it was, I thought it was pretty solid. And hell, I think it actually serves as a good bridging point between classic and new. More elaborate sets and cinematography. The Doctor is in a bit of a romance, and definitely quirkier than we had seen him before. But it made him charming. And that's the thing. Even those who don't like the movie itself can agree that Paul McGann did a great job as the 8th Doctor. But the show didn't get a proper revival until New Who in 2005. But that's where Big Finish Productions enters the picture. In 1999, Big Finish began producing original licensed audio dramas featuring classic Doctor Who actors reprising their roles. Initially just the 5th, 6th, and 7th Doctors, Big Finish's audio dramas, or radio plays if you go by that, proved wildly successful and pretty creative and imaginative. Occasionally they delved into much darker and more adult subject matter than Doctor Who had done before, reflecting also the books doing the same, but ultimately it was formatted and presented like classic Who, and it was really damn good. It's here where the 6th Doctor got a critical reevaluation in the fandom thanks to Colin Baker being able to work with much better material and showing off the many facets of his iteration of the Doctor. But for our purposes today, we're heading over to 2001. While the 8th Doctor had had his adventures in print media, this was Paul McGann's big chance to show off his Doctor, creating an ongoing storyline that started with my absolute favorite companion across all of Doctor Who, Charlie Pollard. Charlotte Elspeth Pollard, self-described Edwardian adventuress, traveled with 2 different Doctors, kicked ass, and survived everything the universe and time itself could throw at her and more. And I repeat my statement from a couple episodes ago, where the hell is her 3rd spin-off miniseries, Big Finish? You ended on a cliffhanger 6 years ago! Charlie is very important to today's story, so let's get into her history a bit. Seeking adventure in the year 1930, Charlie dresses up as a boy and boards the airship R-101. If you're unaware of the real history of it, the R-101 crashed and burned shortly after it had been upgraded a year into service, killing all but a few on board. Naturally, in taking this real-life tragedy and turning it into a Doctor Who story, aliens were involved. The Doctor saved Charlie from dying with everyone else, which changed history. Charlie was supposed to die. Official records of her dying and her family informed and etc. The Doctor inadvertently changed history. Still, the Doctor is not just gonna stab someone over that or whatever, so instead took her with him on adventures. Several of which leads us to this one. The Chimes of Midnight is my second favorite Doctor Who audio drama. My actual favorite is Scherzo, not only a fantastic story in itself, but also one that could only be done in the audio medium. Maybe as a book, but I think it loses a lot of its impact because the plot involves a creature made entirely of sound, with the Eighth Doctor and Charlie blinded and only able to hear each other during it. It's a story made for audio that takes full advantage of it being an audio-only experience, and I love stories that are built for the medium they're in. It's been a while since we did something like this, but I'll be doing this episode like the old Minister of Chance review. Pictures of the actors, or approximations, and mostly just summarizing the events while including some snark and a few clips. And I highly recommend checking out The Chimes of Midnight for yourself because it's so goddamn good, especially as a dark Christmas story. So let's dig into Doctor Who, The Chimes of Midnight, and show you all how amazing it is.
Welcome to Atop the Fourth Wall, where Yuletide candles burn. Linkara's gonna give you all a present you've not earned. Not Mensch, you're not the brightest. Frank Miller, you're off the nice list. If you're a comic writer who misuses a license, your gift will be returned. Digging through the shelves for the kind of comic books that would turn Santa's elves into common crooks. He reads them and he weeps while down the chimney creeps. Pajamas with a Marvel trade to watch him when he sleeps. Linkara, he built a snowman, now it has a hole. Linkara, 8 maids, a milking and a young blood troll. Linkara, only one Dickens homage away from going chestnuts. Linkara, this Christmas comic sucks.
I was never particularly fond of this Eighth Doctor theme for this string of adventures. It's not terrible, but it goes deeper and lower than other Who themes, and I admit I actually like the more boisterous, energetic themes to the weirder ones. Nice bass to that synthesizer, though. We open with some great music matching up to the ticks of a grandfather clock, which in turn leads to the sound of a heart beating and almost a gasping, wheezing breath being taken. Great ominous stuff, and I feel bad that I can't play the whole thing for you. We truly begin with the TARDIS landing in a dark space, which the Doctor kind of appreciates because he has no idea where they are, making him nostalgic for when he used to travel around with no idea where he'd be going. The good old days where he'd just land somewhere and murder people with John and Gillian. Good times. Yes, I'm aware of the comic where it speculates that the John and Gillian adventures were just a dream by the Eighth Doctor, but that does make it kind of iffy that he dreams of encouraging his grandchildren to shoot guns at aliens. Anyway, point is, the Doctor has no idea where they are.
You really haven't got a clue?
The console isn't telling me anything at all, just a blank readout.
Well, then you shouldn't have had your console displays use Flash Player. While the doctor looks for some flashlights for them, Charlie deduces that they're in a larder, especially after she accidentally knocks over a glass jar full of raspberry jam. Studying some of the food on the shelves, the doctor determines that they're probably in the very early 1900s. As they leave the larder to investigate further, we cut over to a scullery maid named Edith Thompson singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing to herself while scrubbing pots and pans. The butler, Mr. Shaughnessy, corrects some of her lyrics.
God and singers reconciled.
It's sinners, Edith.
Yeah, God didn't reconcile with singers until Weird Al came along. Big guy loves a good parody. Shaughnessy berates her for how loud she's singing and that it's distracting her from her work. She's excited over Christmas, but he just complains about how poor a job she's done, pointing out how thick the dust on a table is. He remarks that you could write your name in it, but she says that she doesn't know how to write. As such, he demonstrates by writing her name into the table, then orders her back to work.
What is it I always tell you, Edith?
I'm nothing, sir. I'm nobody.
Well, at least she's got a good future career in fighting the Cyclops. Back over to the Doctor and Charlie, the implication of the shifting narrative is that they're in a time in the future after the stuff with Edith. They're in the same scullery. Charlie remarks that it's a bit more primitive than the one her family had in 1930.
But then I didn't spend much time there. It was just the scullery, after all.
So you never engaged in any scullery skullduggery? They switch over to some candles that they find, and the Doctor goes to return the flashlights to the TARDIS. Not that flashlights didn't exist in the early 1900s, but his are a bit more advanced than what they had back then, and he doesn't want things to be more anachronistic than they should be, especially if there aren't any Daleks around to blast them. Some new mysteries enter the picture. Speakers? Whatever. Point is, the dishes are only half done and the water in the sink is still hot, yet everything else is so dark and cold. They find Edith's name in the dust, Charlie commenting that she had an Edith who worked for her family once too. She writes her own name in the dust, and the dust reassembles itself back over it. The Doctor comments that when he returned to the TARDIS, the jam jar that they had knocked over had reassembled itself. Spooky! Someone should take inspiration from that for their own audio drama. Back over to Edith Thompson's time, Mr. Shaughnessy visits Mrs. Baddeley, the house cook, who is preparing Christmas dinner for the owners of the house.
And I've made them one of my famous plum puddings too. Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without one of my plum puddings.
What a perfect tree topper it is!
They've been passed down the Badleys for generations. It's a secret recipe.
The secret ingredient is cocaine, isn't it? Mrs. Baddeley calls in Edith to help her cook, and she briefly objects because of her workload already, but her and Shaughnessy berate her again, and she becomes timid and compliant. She also comments that it's odd that there are more servants downstairs than people upstairs, yet they get the smaller pudding. Once again, they tell her off for such a wicked thought.
We're nothing. We're nobody. Remember that.
Oh, I will.
This self-help seminar isn't going very well. Even after Shaughnessy leaves, Mrs. Baddeley says that Edith won't amount to anything because I guess this place's name is Douchebag Manor. Edith is sent away when Frederick, the chauffeur, enters.
Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without one of your plum puddings, would it, Mrs. Baddeley?
Gordon Ramsay's suddenly going to show up and reveal that the puddings are actually store-bought. And the only thing that actually tastes good in this place. Back over to Charlie and the Doctor, they enter the kitchen and discover the abandoned plum puddings. Charlie even commenting that she's not a fan of it because her cook used to put threepenny bits in it. Which, by the way, I had to look up because of British versus American things. The pronunciation made me think they were saying threepenny bits. Like, I thought it was some ingredient that was thready in it. We'd probably pronounce it threepenny, which for the non-British is referring to coins sometimes baked into it because of old traditions. Plum pudding isn't really a thing in America. In fact, for any UK people watching, in case you didn't know, pudding to us is what you would call custard. And we don't put any money in it. Fun fact I discovered while researching that, threepenny bits is also Cockney slang for boobs. Merry Christmas! Charlie suddenly hears Edith in a kind of ghostly singing, though the Doctor hears nothing. Back to Edith, we actually rewind a little to before she's sent away and Edith seems to hear Charlie talking, but it doesn't matter. Things proceed and Edith is sent away. We learn that Frederick is having an affair with another servant of the house, Mary, who's a lady's maid. Mrs. Baddeley knows about it and is planning on revealing this to their boss. Frederick tries to convince her not to, even trying to bribe her, but she's unmoved.
You should be careful, Mrs. Baddeley. You've left me with nothing to lose.
Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without murder threats! Our heroes enter a rest area for the servants and discover a fireplace frozen in time. The flames in the fireplace are just still. They experiment with how much they can manipulate the environment. They pull a Christmas cracker, and it restores itself almost immediately afterwards like the dust in the jar. However, the Doctor is able to keep the contents of the cracker from returning. A paper hat and a joke. Not even a toy? Call Stuart Ashens. Apparently this place uses Poundland crackers.
Does that do us any good?
Well, firstly, I can wear it. There. Very festive.
Well, now I just want the paper hat to be his thing, like Matt Smith's bow tie or Tom Baker's scarf. As for the joke, it's a classic. When is a door not a door? However, the obvious answer, when it's a jar, is not what's written.
When it's a raspberry jam jar.
Well, that doesn't fit at all. Did AI write the joke?
It's mocking us. Whatever this force is, it's mocking us.
It's going to sue us over the broken jam jar. Back in whenever, Frederick meets with Mary and informs her that Mrs. Baddeley is going to report their indiscretion. Mary doesn't care, completely smitten with Frederick, who simply says their banging was just a bit of fun. Still, she seems a bit on the yandere side, commenting to herself that she won't let anyone get in the way of their love, even Frederick himself. However, that's not the important thing that's said. Rather, Frederick stating that their current situation is all they'll ever be.
We're nothing, Mary. Do you hear me? We're nobody.
I don't know, man, just because politicians think of you that way. As a further test, the doctor burns the paper hat from the cracker, which does destroy it, and the flames shift to a new position. Interacting with the frozen environment allows Charlie to once again hear Edith singing, along with a grandfather clock ticking, and she's transported to Edith in the scullery. They talk for a moment, Edith assuming that Charlie is from upstairs. She even points out her name written in the dust, and Charlie's name forms after from before. However strange that is, a wind seems to blow and Edith's demeanor changes.
There'll be a death here soon.
Edith, what are you saying? Whose death?
Mine, Charlie.
I read it in the script, Charlie. I'm basically a cameo. Charlie is pulled back to the doctor, who says that she seemed to freeze in place like everything else in the house. Charlie reports her encounter with Edith, and as the grandfather clock's ticking begins again, the doctor makes a very uncharacteristic move. They're gonna leave.
There are some mysteries best left unsolved.
Somewhere, Robert Stack grits his teeth and he doesn't know why. However, they're too late. The clock chimes on the hour, and the two hear a woman scream to end part one. They're brought into the world of the house, discovering a dead Edith Thompson drowned in the sink. The other servants we had seen before all come in as the doctor tries to save Edith, but discovers that her lungs are full of water, more than what should be possible for the size of the sink, and as if she had been drowning for a lot longer than they had heard the scream. However, the servants seem not particularly put off that a human being is dead.
To lose a scullery maid on Christmas Eve.
But Edith never was very good at timing.
People wonder why remote work is preferred when these are your managers and co-workers. The doctor tries to reassure them that he and Charlie didn't murder Edith, but they don't think that at all. After all, the doctor is the chief inspector from Scotland Yard, and Charlie is his niece. Something to keep in mind here is that this was before New Who, so most of the audio dramas are structured like Classic Who as multi-part serials. The psychic paper in New Who was a brilliant invention to cut out the padding that Classic Who would sometimes have, where people distrusted the doctor for an episode or two, locked them in cells, etc. So you've got to imagine how weird it is for the doctor that not only are these strangers seeing him as above reproach right out of the gate, but that they say he's actually the chief inspector of Scotland Yard. Our heroes don't question this, and Shaughnessy simply says they hope that he can resolve this before Christmas morning. After all, it had ruined Mrs. Baddeley's plum pudding.
Well, Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without one of your plum pudding.
Screw you, Jesus! This holiday is about plum pudding! Shaughnessy suggests that Edith killed herself, an idea that the doctor concludes is impossible given the way she died, but Mrs. Baddeley suggests that Edith was so stupid that she didn't know it was impossible. Like when Wile E. Coyote can keep running off the edge of a cliff as long as he doesn't look down. Yeah, as you can imagine, our heroes don't buy that for a second, and the servants are shooed off so they can begin their investigation into the murder. The two talk, of course noting how weird the others are acting, and that it's as if they've been given roles to play in a story. Charlie remarks that she'd rather have been amateur sleuths instead of official detectives, which, yeah, might be more fun, but more difficult since you're not in a position of authority to demand cooperation from the suspects then. The doctor notes that Edith was murdered at exactly 10 p.m., Charlie wondering if that was to muffle any signs of struggle under the chimes of the grandfather clock. And yet it's also a rather strange way of doing so because the area is so small. It would have been very likely for someone to walk in while the murder was happening. The doctor sends Charlie off to talk to Mrs. Baddeley and Mary while he goes to talk to Frederick and Shaughnessy, also suspecting that the murder is somehow connected to the time anomaly they experienced.
Take care of yourself, Charlie. There's more to this than meets the eye.
Of course! The Decepticons killed Edith! The doctor talks to Shaughnessy first, but doesn't really get much. Only that he didn't care for Edith. She was just the scullery maid, after all. Over to Charlie and the women, Mary has to take over Edith's duties now that she's dead, much to her objection. Charlie asks Mrs. Baddeley about where she was when Edith was murdered, but the cook is dismissive about the whole thing, instead just acting overly familiar and almost condescending to Charlie as if she was a little girl. She offers Charlie some plum pudding. What? How dare you, Mrs. Baddeley? As Phoenix Wright once said, Christmas Eve means it wasn't Christmas, and Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without your plum pudding, so if you can have plum pudding on not Christmas, then what even is Christmas? Charlie refuses, but Mrs. Baddeley takes offense to that, once again not giving a crap that Edith is dead. She only calms down when Charlie agrees to eat the damn pudding. Back over to the doctor, he asks Shaughnessy about what he can say about the staff. And once more, it's not anything, just that they're the only staff of the house. He also won't discuss his lordship and her ladyship who run the house, and is completely unfazed when the doctor asks if they're conducting any time experiments or using futuristic equipment. Only that it's not his place to comment on things. That he is nothing and nobody.
Only in service do we derive any meaning or purpose.
If ever there was a place that needed a union. He denies killing Edith, and back over to the kitchen, Mrs. Baddeley somehow knows that Charlie once broke a tooth on a threepenny bit, and indeed, as Charlie eats the pudding, she seems to revert to her childhood for a moment before returning to normal in confusion over what just happened. Mrs. Baddeley denies killing Edith as well, and Charlie goes off to question Mary, while the doctor proceeds to Frederick. Frederick says it's exciting to be in a real-life murder mystery with the doctor, citing a few cases he's been on, except as the doctor points out, said mysteries are actually Agatha Christie novels. And in fact, Frederick now says that the doctor doesn't work for Scotland Yard, but as Charlie had wished for, they're now amateur sleuths. Man, and I thought doing this job for 15 years went by fast. The doctor's career is zipping around in 15 minutes. He asks Frederick who he thinks did it, but Frederick says he's only paid to drive the Chrysler. That gets the doctor's attention though, and he asks Frederick what year it is.
Yes, sir, it's 1906.
But Agatha Christie wasn't published until 1920, so how do you know who she was?
God, and Agatha Christie's career is going by so fast, she's doing it before she was ever published! What's more, Frederick said he drove a Chrysler, which wasn't invented until 1924. Frederick corrects himself and says he meant a Bentley and that he's clearly just confused. He doesn't know what year it is or anything, he just drives a car.
The Chrysler, is there?
Yes, the Chrysler. No, I mean the Bentley. The Chrysler hasn't been invented yet.
Nice execution.
You're doing terrific.
Charlie's interview with Mary isn't going any better, as she's just constantly complaining about having to do Edith's job. However, a ghostly voice of Edith summons Charlie back to the darker version of the house. The voice continues to speak to her.
Please find out who killed me soon. I'm so tired of dying.
Yeah, after the 5th funeral, it just starts to feel kind of hollow, you know? While she can't tell Charlie who killed her, she does give her 2 pieces of information. That another murder will happen soon that will cause everyone to forget Edith, and a more mysterious message than that, Edward Grove is alive. You think he's tired of dying too? After once again hearing the clock chimes and a scream, Charlie has returned to the house, and everyone discovers Mrs. Baddeley dead on the kitchen counter. Threepenny coins have been put on her eyes, and she's been stuffed full of her own plum pudding. Oh my god, people! This is not a drill! The plum pudding is down! The plum pudding is down! Christmas is ruined! Once more, the other servants are less bothered by the murder and more the loss of staff, and the plum pudding, of course. Shaughnessy once again says it must be suicide, which of course the doctor refutes this and shuffles them off so he and Charlie can speak. They compare notes, Charlie in particular talking about her ghostly encounter with Edith, and the doctor comments that they seem to be following the rules of a mystery like this. Killings on the hour. That this Edward Grove can't be the killer because it's someone they haven't met yet. The murders themselves being representations of the victims' jobs, etc. What's more, neither Edith nor Mrs. Baddeley had time to scream before being killed, so where did the scream come from?
There's something I'm missing. There's something that's staring me in the face and I can't see it.
I've got it! Elves! No, but Charlie has the answer there. The killings are happening on the hour every hour as dictated by the clock chimes, but that was not an hour between killings. Whatever is killing the staff has to kill them on the hour, but it's clearly doing something to accelerate that process.
Where are we going?
To find a clock, of course. To find out what time it really is.
What time is it? Meanwhile, Mary goes to see Frederick, thanking him for killing Mrs. Baddeley so they can be together. But Frederick says he didn't and actually thought that Mary did it. What's more, Frederick says it's impossible for him to get together with Mary. After all, she's just a scullery maid. Mary says she thought that was Edith, but Frederick doesn't even remember Edith existing, and soon Mary forgets her too. Oh, sure, you'll forget the last scullery maid and say the scullery maid is nothing and not worthy of love, but we'll see what happens when you have to scrape off the food with an old disintegrating SOS pad, Fred Dick. Charlie and the doctor go to Shaughnessy. See, that grandfather clock that's been ticking in the background for a lot of this audio drama? They can't find it. Shaughnessy says that the servants don't need to know the time and refuses to give up his pocket watch when they ask for it. As such, our heroes decide it's time to finally go upstairs, and Shaughnessy pulls out a gun, nervously saying that no one is allowed upstairs until they're summoned. He refuses to give up the gun, but then the doctor asks for the watch again and Shaughnessy hands it over, oblivious to what he's done, and he happily leaves the two alone. The doctor explains that clearly the force behind all this was partly controlling him, but it can't concentrate on two things at once. Hence it couldn't threaten them with the gun and protect the watch at the same time. Who knew this thing was me trying to write scripts? They check the time, and time is moving faster than normal. Well, at least until they point it out and the watch stops as if afraid to move, before then rapidly moving again to try to approach midnight. The doctor summons all the servants into the room to protect them from whatever's murdering them, but they refuse to stay in one place, saying that there haven't been 2 murders on the hour so far, only 1. They've forgotten that Edith ever existed, and Mary has always been the scullery maid. The clock strikes midnight to end part 2. However, we pick things up not at midnight, but back at 10 p.m. again. Time has reset and Edith is dead again, though instead of being drowned in the sink, she's been suffocated with a sink plunger. Oh my god! The Daleks are the killer! The servants return and things play out as they did when they first met. Mrs. Baddeley even alive again, although this time they don't mention the doctor being the chief inspector of Scotland Yard. The mysteries are just piling on each other. After all, if they'd gone back in time, why was Edith killed differently? What's more, the doctor notices a third name now faintly written in the dust. Edward Grove, almost like a signature on a painting. Happy little trees, happy little murders, point is the same, beat the devil out of it. Since they know that Mrs. Baddeley is supposed to die next, the doctor sends Charlie to stay with her while he goes to investigate a hunch. He goes to see Frederick and Mary, saying he wants Frederick to give him a drive in his Bentley or whatever. He gives them an order to do so, and they're inclined to obey, but they then say they're not allowed to, having been given instructions to attack the doctor if he tries to leave the house. They're so casual about it, as if there's absolutely nothing wrong with what they're saying, and that this is just them fulfilling their roles. They also tell the doctor that they suspect that they're the killers. Well, anticlimactic end of the mystery, I guess. Charlie goes over to Mrs. Baddeley again, who's mimicking some of Edith's behavior, like humming Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Charlie even has to remind her that Edith is dead, but once more, this news does not disturb her.
Now, my poppet, would you like a piece of plum pudding?
It's gonna turn out the killer is the plum pudding come to life, and that's not even the weirdest thing that's ever happened on Doctor Who. Turns out Mary and Frederick know that they have the perfect motive to kill Mrs. Baddeley and can't work out which of them did it. Except, as the doctor points out, Mrs. Baddeley hasn't died yet, and they say they wouldn't have killed Edith.
Edith is nothing. Edith is nobody.
This is going to be really embarrassing when it turns out this was an undercover boss situation and Edith was actually their employer. Frederick asks if he's been murdered yet, which of course the doctor reassures him he hasn't. So if you guys keep calling Edith a nobody, we can certainly accelerate that. Charlie starts to get a headache and remember something as Mrs. Baddeley keeps pushing the plum pudding.
And Christmas wouldn't be... It wouldn't be...
Christmas without my plum pudding.
Suck it, Labor Day! You don't have plum pudding! Mrs. Baddeley then very confusedly starts saying that Charlie was always her favorite and she only made the plum pudding for her. She was the only one who was ever nice to her, that she was nothing and nobody to everyone else.
Oh, I'm feeling dizzy. What's in this plum pudding?
Plums, my poppet.
Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without poison! She also says that she was horribly upset when Charlie died, but it's all better now that she's back from the dead. Charlie's pulled back into the dark by Edith, who's angry that Charlie has forgotten her.
Doesn't matter who killed me, only why I had to die after all.
You know, Edith, you're being a real Debbie Downer this Christmas. What do you have to be unhappy about? Oh, right, everything. Edith asks why she's dead if Charlie is alive, then once again warns about another death.
Edward Grove is alive. I am making Edward Grove alive.
I've decided to become Dr. Frankenstein, Charlie. Charlie returns to the kitchen and warns Mrs. Baddeley that she's going to be the next victim, but then they hear a scream and follow it. Frederick is dead, and the doctor reports that it was weird. When the clock struck, time seemed to freeze, and then bang, he was dead. And following in the pattern of the other deaths linked to their professions,
To be killed by your own Chrysler. Or Bentley, whichever it was.
wow! And now Elon Musk's career is going super fast. The self-driving cars aren't working 100 years before they were made. Shaughnessy once again says it must be suicide, and the doctor's sarcastic, yeah, he probably ran himself over, is met with agreement by the butler. Mary is the only one affected by this because they were in love, but Mrs. Baddeley and Shaughnessy say it's impossible. He couldn't have loved a scullery maid. Like before, everyone has forgotten Edith and thinks that Mary was always the scullery maid, and she agrees that he couldn't have loved a scullery maid and is happy to go back to work. They leave the doctor and Charlie, who is once again puzzled about the suicide talk. The doctor suggests that their insistence might mean something, that they know a piece of the puzzle that our heroes don't.
It seems to me that this is a murder mystery where the murders themselves are the red herrings.
I'm telling you guys, the real crime going on here is that someone is trying to steal the recipe to the plum pudding. The mystery of all this just deepens in the doctor's eyes. Why the killings? Sure, they're killed in over-the-top ways, but they don't suffer. From tick to tock, you're dead. There's no evident malice or sadism in it. No evident reason why they're happening. And then Charlie wonders why Edith got killed twice, though the doctor suggests that it could have just been a bad roll of the dice for her. Even worse if she had been killed twice in the same loop. Charlie, however, thinks there's something more to Edith in particular because she keeps seeing her, becoming especially frustrated because she's trying to make Charlie remember something, and everyone else keeps forgetting Edith at that. The doctor tells her not to think about that Edith died before she was even born, but Charlie's having none of it, going to see if Edith's name is still written in the dust to prove that she did indeed exist. The doctor, however, is tired of playing the whole detective game and decides on a course of action to try to force a confrontation with whatever is behind this. Charlie returns to the dusty table, but indeed, Edith's name is gone. Edith reappears to her, berating her for forgetting her.
You're just like all the others. I should never have died for you.
I took a sink plunger to the face for you, Charlie! Edith says she can make Charlie remember her and nothing but her, words suddenly scratching themselves into the table. Edward Grove is alive.
Edward Grove is alive. Together, my puppet, we make him so.
Edward Grove is our chia pet. The doctor heads to the staircase leading to the upstairs of the house, loudly announcing that he's going to leave the servant quarters. Shaughnessy has to rush up with his gun to stop him, but the doctor says that that's what he wanted. He knows he can't actually go upstairs, suspecting that it's actually a void up there anyway. He just wanted to force one of them to try to stop him because it makes their minds a little clearer. Shaughnessy does seem a little more lucid, wanting to know what is going on and what's killing his staff. The doctor realizes that this area is in some kind of a time loop, repeating the same 2 hours of time over and over. The servants are aware of it on a subconscious level, but they've done it so much that they're in a kind of quasi-hypnotic fugue. That's why they seem so disinterested in the deaths or sense their own approaching. The force at work is incorporating new elements into the time loop based on things Charlie and the doctor said, trying to keep it stable. The doctor asks Shaughnessy the big question, who the hell is Edward Grove? And Shaughnessy tells him, the place is Edward Grove.
The only witness to all that has been going on here is the house itself.
I gotta tell you, the time-looped murders are not helping its market value.
Edward Grove is the killer, and we are standing within his belly.
Wait a minute. That means that this bastard already ate the plum pudding! The house summons the other servants to kill the doctor, but as our hero points out, the house can only kill on the hour, so even when Shaughnessy fires his gun, the bullet just zips back inside the chamber.
I'm sorry, sir, but I'm getting an irresistible urge to shoot you in the head.
Well, stiff upper lip and all that.
Man, the Eighth Doctor is really underrated for his sass. And I haven't really talked about the Eighth Doctor much, but that's only because it's a very different experience hearing him in audio versus seeing him in a TV show. 8 was Byron-esque, not just in his original dress sense, but how passionate and full of life he was. I've complained before that the problem with the Fifth Doctor was that while he was so nice and charming, he was often passive and let himself get swept up into a situation rather than being an active participant in dealing with said situation. 8 embodies the same pleasantness and charm, but is definitely more of a proactive force. But he was always trying to be nice and a peacemaker, which is of course contrasted by him having a heavy track record of tragedy when it came to his companions. And he was ultimately swept up into the Time War at the end of his life. The man who loved life and living so much ended up seeing so much death and horror, but he tried to remain kind until the end, and he died for it. Also, I don't know, I thought the wig looked fine on him myself. The doctor tries to break them out of the weird hypnosis that Edward Grove has on them by reminding them that they're taking orders from a literal house, but unfortunately Charlie's interactions with Edith have gotten her absorbed into the roles they're meant to play, as she's now become the daughter of his lordship, which is evidence enough for them that they serve a human master.
No doubt you're here for a Christmas party, Doctor. It starts at the chimes of midnight.
Is your 1906 Christmas party a rave or something? I just have a hard time believing that you're all just waiting for midnight for the party to start in this era. The clock strikes and they shoot him, but as before, the time loop resets and they're back in the scullery with a dead Edith Thompson. Charlie's mind is restored, thankfully, but now when the servants come in to see the dead body, they just completely disregard it and pretend Edith never existed right out of the gate. After they leave, the doctor explains to Charlie about how Edward Grove is the house, come alive and feeding on all the death within it. Edith's death, however it happened, was somehow the catalyst, and a time loop that allows it to keep growing more powerful and sentient with each death. It kills on the hour, resets, and feeds again and again on the lives within, their conversations, their hopes, and incorporates them into its little murder mystery that goes around and around forever. It's a never-ending cycle of death and food for Edward Grove. And meanwhile, it gives not one damn about those pots and pans when it kills Edith over and over. Oh, sure, Mary takes over, but she's the lady's maid. What's she gonna do? Tie a corset around a saucepan? So how the hell did this even happen? As Charlie points out, it is just a house after all. The doctor makes mention about a theory concerning ghosts, that they're actually the psychic remains of events within a house that the walls absorb, a kind of recording of traumatic or high emotion moments. If you want a full movie talking about that idea, check out the old TV movie The Stone Tape.
Can you imagine what would happen if a house was given nothing but traumatic events?
Edward Grove is alive, and it needs therapy. Still, the doctor points out that the house itself is not the source of the time loop. If anything, it's just another victim of it. Some paradox occurred that began this loop. The doctor suddenly realizes what the paradox is and tells Charlie that they're leaving. If they don't, they'll be trapped just like the servants. Speaking of, the servants come back to plead with them to stay.
Is that true, my poppet? But I've so much plum pudding to feed you.
Unlimited plum pudding, etc., etc. The two leave, but soon Charlie begins to hear the grandfather clock again. The inside of the TARDIS transforms back into the scullery, the doctor realizing that he somehow brought the house with them instead of escaping it, ending part 3. They're still inside the TARDIS, but it's become just another part of Edward Grove, even having another police box in the larder as before. Charlie, not quite understanding the spatial loop, suggests going inside and taking off again, only to find another scullery inside.
Ship has one bridge. One bridge!
The doctor spells out just how bad this is. They're stuck in infinity, time and space compressed into the basement of the house on a loop. Soon, they'll be absorbed into the events and it will be all that they'll have ever known. Time is meaningless because it's an inescapable circle.
We live for 2 short hours, or we live forever.
As an aside, that line is one of those ones that stuck with me ever since I first listened to this. It is so creepy and so succinct a description of their plight. 10 out of 10. Charlie says that if they could find the source of the initial paradox that caused the time loop, they could escape it, but the doctor says that's impossible. It's them. Somehow their initial arrival here created the paradox. He doesn't know the exact details why, but now they're inside of it and they can't get out. The servants return, now much more aware of their situation. They say Edward Grove has seen fit to let them know what's up, and that Edward Grove wants to speak to the doctor. They whisk Charlie away somewhere else for safekeeping, and Edward Grove arrives as the clock approaches 11 p.m. Time speeding up, and then slowing down massively as the clock chimes. Edward Grove's consciousness possesses Shaughnessy to speak through him.
Edward Grove, I presume.
You presume correctly.
And you're alive, I gather. Well done.
Here's a cookie, good for you! While the doctor sits down to speak with Edward Grove, Charlie once again meets up with Edith in the dark. Charlie asks to actually see her, but Edith is worried Charlie won't recognize her, that all the pain she went through would have been for nothing. Charlie reassures her that regardless, she'll help her, and thus she finally appears, and Charlie does recognize her. Edith Thompson is her old family cook from when she was a little girl. Edith explains that long before she became a cook, she was a scullery maid in 1906. Her looks deteriorated from the harsh life as a servant during that time, but as the Pollard family cook, she would always make plum pudding at Christmas. Always Charlie's favorite, as Mrs. Baddeley put it. Charlie probably should have complained more about the threepenny bits then. Charlie was the only one in her life who ever showed her kindness, and now she needs the ultimate kindness. She needs to know if she's alive or dead. Well, in the third iteration of the loop, we saw that you had been beaten to death with a broom handle, so I'm gonna write that down in the probably dead column. She wants Charlie to tell her because Edith died for Charlie. More on that in a bit. Back with the Doctor, he hears the slowed down chimes of the clock. Edward Grove only has direct influence and power on them when the hour strikes. He gains his power from the time loop itself, and our heroes were only able to enter the loop when the hour hit. Edward Grove, as Mary makes some tea for them, explaining that even though he can't actually drink it, he enjoys having the servants do things for him. The Doctor calls this whole thing obscene, feeding off the lives of the servants and their deaths, but Edward Grove shrugs that off. That they never had real lives and hopes because of how crappy their positions in life were. And he tries to not be cruel to them by making their deaths instantaneous. And I guess making the deaths ironically tied to their professions is just because it's funny or something. Edward Grove states that as the working staff, their lives were just the same as the time loop, forever trapped in a cycle of abuse and repeating their jobs. That their jobs were all that they were or ever would be. They are nothing and nobody. The chauffeur, the butler, the lady's maid, the cook, and the scullery maid. Nothing more than that ever, while the people upstairs are the important ones who make decisions and affect everything. The Doctor asks what exactly Edward Grove intends to do with his life now that he has it, and he doesn't intend to do anything. He just wants to be alive. Dude, what the hell's the point of being alive if you can't even eat the plum pudding? The Doctor rants that none of this matters because of the time loop. That this is a pale parody of life where none of them are allowed to live or die because it just keeps resetting and there's never any chance to affect anything. And Edward Grove does not care.
Edward Grove is alive. That's enough for me.
He says that, but then they're going to find black mold in his walls, and we'll see how that just being alive thing works out for him and the building inspector. Back with Charlie and Edith, we learn the full breadth of how crappy Edith's life was. It was always the same no matter where she worked. Bullying butlers, maids and other cooks that looked down on her, people of status that ignored her or abused her. She was nothing to them, a nobody. She had an affair with a chauffeur once, who of course just did it for the sex, discarding the idea that a chauffeur could ever love a scullery maid. Not Frederick specifically. As she explains, all these assholes just kind of blur together over the years, but the things we've been seeing playing out in the loop are representations of her life. Her suffering, the insulting remarks she endured. Even the Chrysler thing is a reference to that. The chauffeur seduced her in his Chrysler. Think somebody seduced her in a Bentley too? But there was Charlotte Pollard, the girl who always remembered her and was always kind to her. And she died for Charlie when Charlie died. But then Charlie came back to life. Back to the Doctor.
How about a piece of plum pudding? Mrs. Baddeley would be only too happy to rustle you up a piece.
I don't think you appreciate the true meaning of plum pudding, Mr. Grove. Grove apologizes for trying to kill the Doctor earlier, blaming it on his youth and inexperience. Now that he's older, he understands the nature of the time loop and how he came to life. The incident that caused the time loop was indeed a death. Specifically Edith's. She committed suicide at midnight on Christmas Eve, 1930, after learning of Charlie's supposed death in the R-101 airship. The scream they kept hearing was Edith's upon cutting her own wrists. But then, Charlie didn't die. History was changed, and then the Doctor and Charlie landed at Edward Grove in 1906, bringing Charlie and Edith in close contact with each other, thus the reason for her suicide is undone by Charlie being alive. Now this part is a bit of a stretch for me. Why would the paradox come about when they landed in 1906? Charlie wasn't born yet, and Edith wouldn't know her, so obviously her having supposedly died wouldn't make a difference at this point in time. Wouldn't it make more sense if they had landed in 1930 again? I don't know, maybe it's because they hadn't landed on Earth during this specific time period where Edith was alive before now. Still seems like a stretch in my opinion, but yeah, Edith is both alive and dead because both timelines now exist simultaneously. One where Charlie died on the R-101 and she killed herself in her grief, and one where Charlie lived and she chose not to commit suicide. They are the Schrodinger's cat of time paradoxes, alive and dead at the same time, and it's keeping the time loop going until Charlie decides which way to go. The Doctor, meanwhile, says it was a freak accident that made Edward Grove alive, but it has to stop. He has intelligence and consciousness, but nothing resembling, well, actual life in his eyes. Even now, we can only truly exist during the clock chimes, which run out eventually, and only through Shaughnessy, an actual living being. He tells Edward Grove that he needs to give up on his impossible dream of living, that the servants deserve to have their own lives because they already have it, whereas the house is just a shadow of life.
You are asking me to commit suicide.
I am.
Now, I'm kind of conflicted about this, because on one hand, a major theme of the story is that nobody is worthless, that being alive is superior to being dead, But here's the doctor saying, no, Edward Grove, you need to die and kill yourself to do so. Let's try to parse this out a bit. A common sci-fi trope and theme is the question of whether humanity deserves to survive, usually asking this after an apocalypse and all. After all, as a collective species, we're certainly guilty of our fair share of horrible things. Thus, the thinking goes, if we're not going to be better than we were before, why should we endure? I don't know if I entirely agree with it, but it is a thought that gets brought up. That if the only thing to come out of that survival is causing more harm, then what is the moral good in sticking around? Edward Grove is alive, but he can only be alive if he tortures and harms people. He has no interest in doing anything with his life but continue to exist and perpetuate this cycle of suffering. He cannot grow beyond the confines of his existence. At best, he can sustain his form for longer periods of time between the ticks of the clock, but he shall never be anything more than what he is, a torturing murderer preying on the pain of his prisoners. Rest assured, Edward Grove does not care about the lives he has taken away from these people, viewing them as inferior to him. He balks at the idea that the servants are worthy of life because of their social status, of their jobs, that they will amount to nothing, that they are nobody simply because they don't hold wealth or status in their society. Whereas he has value simply by being their superior, their lordship, the one keeping them alive forever in the time loop. But their existences are meaningless to him beyond how they can sustain him. He holds value not in life, but in being alive. And there is a selfish difference present here, because he believes that his being alive is more important than his servants living. But even if we were to acknowledge that Edward Grove deserves to live just as much as his victims, well, it's the trolley problem, isn't it? One life versus many lives.
It's numbers. Cold, unsympathetic numbers.
Regardless of how you feel about the morality of encouraging one new unique life form to kill itself to save others, ultimately we're here to talk about the Doctor. And as I discussed in the Remembrance of the Daleks review, the Doctor's morality is motivated by a need to set things right. A great injustice has been made against these people, and Edward Grove is the one who committed that injustice. And the Doctor has to set it right. As Charlie mulls over the question of whether she's alive or dead, she gets caught up in the paradox plaguing Edith, simultaneously remembering dying in the flames of the R-101, as well as surviving it. Edward Grove refuses to die, instead deciding to compress the time loop down to just the moments that he's conscious and aware, during the murders, just to keep himself alive. The Doctor realizes the only way to stop this is to keep Edith from killing herself, prevent that death from starting the time loop. As Edward Grove says, though, she's currently in the place where the dead wait between the loops and the living can't reach. However, since they're currently in the middle of the clock chimes, the moment when a death needs to occur, the Doctor orders Shaughnessy to strangle him to death. Shaughnessy, being a well-bred butler who can't refuse an order from a gentleman, kills the Doctor. Would have been really awkward if he regenerated instead. Well, Shaughnessy, give it a few more goes, I'm sure it'll stick. Doctor travels to the dark space and pulls Charlie back from giving into despair about dying in the R-101, reminding her of all the adventures they'd gone on together, all the people they'd met, and how she made a difference in his life. Right or wrong for changing history, they chose life. However, Edward Grove pushes his influence on Edith, trying to get her own depression and self-loathing to still have her kill herself. After all, Edith won't be visiting alien planets or going on time-traveling adventures.
Die and the time loop will go on. Die and you'll be dying forever.
Another line that stuck with me for years. Good stuff. Edith says that life would be worth living if Charlie remembers her, thinks of her and all the places she's going. It'd prove she made a difference.
I will not kill myself. However bad it might be, however lonely I might get, I choose to live.
And with the chimes of the clock striking, the Doctor and Charlie find themselves back inside the TARDIS, the time loop broken. They materialize normally in 1906 as had originally been intended, finding a young Edith being scolded by a butler. They claim, as this had all started, to be an inspector of Scotland Yard and his niece, just popping downstairs away from the Christmas party.
And we've been inspecting your larder.
There had better be plum pudding down here or we're burning this place to the ground! The Doctor says their host had been bragging about how good the larder was, and he's confirmed it, wanting the butler to convey his compliments to the scullery maid. And to do it now!
Edith, you are a fine scullery maid.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you.
Unfortunately, this just creates a new time loop where Edith is obsessed with a single compliment from this butler. The clock strikes normally and they wish the two Merry Christmas. Before they leave, though, Charlie takes Edith aside.
Remember, you are not nothing. You are not nobody. You are Edith Thompson. Be proud of that.
Although be less proud of the preservatives, they're very easy to knock off the shelf. Charlie admits to the Doctor that she can still remember the alternate version of events where she dies and doesn't know what it means, although neither does the Doctor. It's only relevant to the ongoing storyline that was happening in the audio dramas, though, so not important to get into here. And so our audio drama ends with Edith feeling reassured about herself and singing Hark the Herald Angels Sing. I'd love to make some thematic point about how Hark the Herald Angels Sing ties into the themes of the story, but, you know, it's just about Jesus' birth and how awesome that is. Okay, maybe in the third verse and born that men no more may die might work, but that seems like a stretch. And the point is, the Chimes of Midnight is amazing. There's so much you can get into with this. The acting is superb. Louise Rolfe as Edith seamlessly switching between excited youth to fearfully subservient to depressed resignation on a dime. Paul McGann bringing his usual wit and charm that makes him such a likable incarnation. And of course, India Fisher bringing her regular A-game as Charlie. Intelligent, vulnerable, adventurous, but also tragic. The writing by Rob Shearman is superb, taking innocuous comments and even sickeningly sugary repetitions of lines and making them increasingly creepy as they go on. And yet mixed in with that are moments of dark humor and snark. Not anything that makes the speakers feel superior to the situation, but rather commenting on the absurdity of the situation they find themselves in. The atmosphere is thick in this story, a dark Christmas ghost story with twists and turns that seem random and weird for the sake of being weird, but all come together in the end to tell a story about choosing life, that you are loved, that you do make a difference in other people's lives even if you don't realize it. And that is a great message around Christmas time, which can be dark and cold and alone for many. You are not nothing. You are not nobody. Your life has value, certainly more so than some old house filled with death and torment. If I have to criticize anything, it's that Part 4 feels weaker than the rest. Edward Grove was scarier as an unseen, barely heard presence, but once he has a voice and thoughts, the malevolence and dread are not quite there, especially since a lot of it is an exposition dump to explain everything. But it's also kinda necessary, since that helps tie the themes together. All the pieces and clues that were laid out throughout the tale. It's a murder mystery where the murders are a distraction from the real story. It's a ghost story where the dead find not rest, but resurrection. And it's a Christmas story about joy, life, and humanity, but not from the season itself. Rather, how much we affect and care about each other. Next time, we're not actually doing something Christmas-related, just have a long-held-back Patreon-sponsored review. We're looking at the first 3 episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! Capsule Monsters. Okay, let's do this.
And then there were 2.
You defeated the Blue Knight of Titan in the semifinals.
I wouldn't be here if I hadn't.
Yeah, but that's the thing. I saw the match, if you can call it that. A scale that measures your heart. Surprised the Temlins let him get away with that.
Because they understood the same thing I did as soon as he proposed that contest. It wasn't about morality or ethics or whether you were a good guy or bad guy. It was about righteousness. About how committed to your cause you were.
And he was found lacking. That also surprises me.
You said you saw what happened. I played him like a fiddle to make it a true contest. It actually took less time than I expected to have him wallowing in guilt over turning his back on his team, whether going after the evil forces who were running away was truly the right move. I understand the power of words just as much as the power of a gun.
You bested Impera by negating her magics. You brought down the Blue Knight of Titan with brilliant oratory, Appropriato with weapons, Robert Paul with knowledge and experience. At every turn, you have proven yourself a worthy adversary.
I'm flattered. And you're right. I am worthy. The only one worthy of that gauntlet.
But you haven't beaten me yet.
Skarn was a pompous ass. You didn't defeat Heavy Rex. You needed someone else to do it for you. You barely won your race, and Billy Tor surrendered because he didn't care anymore. Oh, and what's more, it wasn't even you who got him to surrender. You're a joke, Linkara. You've gotten this far on luck, desperation, and other people doing the heavy lifting. This tournament is as good as over.
I've also been at a disadvantage the entire contest because it never selected me to choose the fight. Until now. I choose what the final contest is.
Then choose your contest. Pistols at dawn with your magic gun? Do I need to face down your giant robot? Who writes the better review of a Superman comic or something?
Yu-Gi-Oh!
Yu-Gi-Oh?
It's a card game.
I've heard of it.
Great! Then you have no objections to it.
I do, actually.
Tough! I spoke to the Temlins already. Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Duel Monsters as it's called in the anime, exists in your universe with pretty much the same cards and rules. To even things out and keep it less complicated, I've gone ahead and prepared the exact version and approved card list and restrictions we'll be using. Not exactly standard tournament format, but it'll do. And one other thing. You've got 1 week in your universe's timescale. The Temlins agree this has gone on too long, and their sponsors are getting antsy and want to start prepping for the 1050th contest. You've got that much time to prepare, then we end this.
Very well. I'll study the rules of your little card game. I look forward to wearing the gauntlet once this nonsense is over.
Is this a bad time? The asshole just left. Thought you were on a date with your boyfriends. They had to turn in early for the night. Figured I'd get some work done on that confession box. Been putting it off for a while now. I'll get out of your hair. Knowing our luck, whoever sent it is gonna come back at Halloween to really kick our asses.
Christmas wouldn't be Christmas without your plum pudding.
That's not a very original observation, Edith.
Hello, my friends. Please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell for notifications on new video releases. If you'd like to support future videos, you can check out my Patreon or purchase a t-shirt via Teespring or Shark Robot. Thanks for watching!